they knew precisely where to jab at us. They knew precisely the type of things to bring up to us. They knew the things that we felt guilty about that any normal, average, well-adjusted teenager would just look at as part of growing up. But they would make us feel bad about being us. And a lot of these thought processes start when you are in this age category.
Right. I'm like laughing on the outside and playing along, but inside I'm like, did I do something wrong? Did I do something bad? And I never, ever got over that.
There are so many ways that they manipulate you and shove your thinking in directions that are just not healthy at all. How could you steer me into this and then turn away from it and talk about it this way? Well, if it bothers you that much, you can follow me out too. There is that.
Welcome to Unbound,
a podcast for new atheists
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals,
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle. And it's time to get unbound.
All night long lock-ins and vows to stay virgins, Notre Dame fight songs and flash mob collegians, sex-shaming females who wore too much bling. These are a few of the cringeworthy things we'll be talking about tonight. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle.
And welcome to part 2 of our series. I think it's just going to be a two-parter on how evangelicals get you when you're young.
Yes.
The 4 to 14 principle, or whatever it is the Nazarenes called it, that age group that is so vitally important for continuing to keep the quiver full and expanding. Mm-hmm. And that's really what this is all about, making sure that they collect you and keep you for life. And it starts at birth, just like we talked about last week. Yeah. But let me tell you, once you get into the middle school and high school end of this, it becomes super, super, super sinister.
Yeah.
It really does.
Definitely.
Now, again, I'll make the disclaimer. I don't think that the individuals that do this do it with ill intent. And I've got a whole thing on that toward the end. But the system is rigged.
Yeah.
It is rigged against this age group. Anyone who, well, not anyone, but 80%, it was 80% of those who do not accept Christ by age 18 never will. And as I've said before on this show, there's a reason for that. Because if that thinking hasn't been drilled into you from the time you're little, logic and reason take over, and your brain just won't accept this stuff because it's so out there. So that's why they do it the way that they do it. We're going to talk a little bit. We're going to talk a lot. We're going to talk a lot about teen youth ministry tonight. And by teen youth ministry, I'm talking about anything that's basically middle school or older. That's somewhere in the 11 or 12-year-old range and up.
Yes.
So at the point in people's lives when they struggle most with identity, acceptance, self-awareness, and autonomy, evangelical youth ministries go for the jugular. They attack virtually everything that teens do, from innocuous activities like going to the movies to legitimate concerns like irresponsible sexual experimentation and drug use. Here's the problem. The pseudo-logic they apply to these things goes way further toward piquing interest in them than it ever does to prevent them. And when bad things happen, there is never any logical, practical advice or help offered for dealing with them that goes beyond repenting, praying, and staying plugged into church.
Yep.
Some of the more progressive churches out there and pastors might recommend counseling, but those instances are rare. And they typically involve counseling provided by a pastor, just like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Not a therapist, not a social worker, or any kind of medical professional that can provide actual help. And that is where the problem lies. We talked about how they instill mental illness.
Yes.
Well, this is a big part of it. And let me tell you, you can really fuck up a teenager with all of this dogma. It's very, very easy to do. But it comes down to, and this was one of the things that I had drilled into me from the time that I really started getting plugged in around age 13. The concept of being separate, The concept of not being part of this world. Petra, again, had an album and a song called Not of This World. We are strangers. We are aliens. We are not of this world. Mm-hmm. Really? Where am I from? Betelgeuse? No, we belong here, and we are people with a very, very complex persona. All of us have a very complex persona that Christianity tries to shrink down into this little package that most people, no one really fits well into.
No.
But there are plenty of people that make themselves fit their square peg into this round hole. And as a teenager, you're being forced into the position of doing that a lot. And it's not even just the spiritual stuff. Just growing up, just coming to know yourself as a person, just obtaining that sense of autonomy is difficult without all of this static thrown in. But they really do plug this concept of separatism. Come out from among them and be separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. That's 2 Corinthians 6:17. It's an Old Testament reference too. I don't remember exactly where. It's just I know the 2 Corinthians one because that's the one that they drill into you. They try and keep it as New Testament as possible because there's a lot of people out there who still believe that the Old Testament, while it's still God's word, it's not as relevant.
Right.
Well, it is. Jesus said that he came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. So it's every bit as relevant. But this is the verse that sticks in my head because it's the one that was drilled into me. 2 Corinthians 6:17, come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. In other words, yeah, I'll be your daddy as long as you're good enough. And that's just the running theme with the way that Yahweh deals with humanity anyway. But there were a lot of pressures to maintain that separate kind of attitude toward everything. We weren't supposed to watch secular movies. We weren't supposed to listen to secular music. If we were reading novels and that book had an author whose name wasn't something like Peretti, Lawhead, Elwood, or Lewis, shame on you. The more wishful thinkers out there also didn't mind authors like J.R.R. Tolkien or Madeleine L'Engle because there were rumors that these people were Christians. I've met Madeleine L'Engle, and I never got a real evangelical vibe off of her at all. There are overtly Judeo-Christian themes in the things that she wrote. It was never evangelistic.
No.
There was nothing about what she wrote that was supposed to lead you into any area of belief. They were just stories.
Yeah.
Very well told stories, I might add. But books, novels, these things were vilified also. If you want to read something, pick up your Bible. You don't do that enough.
Right.
That was what we were told a lot. Turn off the radio and spend your entire McDonald's paycheck on Christian music you can't hear any other way. That was me. Mm-hmm. That was me. I had... and still have. I have most of my music. I still have most of my music sitting downstairs.
Yep.
And I keep it not because I ever intend to listen to most of it again. And there is some that I still like, but most of it is just still sitting in boxes. And the reason I still have it is because, for good or for bad, this is part of who I was.
Right.
I've gotten rid of a lot of stuff. I've gotten rid of a lot of Bibles. I've gotten rid of a lot of Christian books. Anything that I considered fluff, anything that I didn't think would have any benefit for me to ever see again, let alone have any interaction with, it has been swept out. But the music has always been a soft spot for me, mostly because of the personal investment involved in it.
Right.
But also because there are lots and lots of good memories for me that are tied to that music, things that I was able to do, people that I interacted with. We talked about the owner of that bookstore a few weeks ago. A lot of the music came from there. And I remember him fondly. And I remember those times when I hung out in that store and just talked with him for lengthy periods of time, especially after I had my license. I would be over there quite a bit, that store and a couple of others that I would hang out in. And the music, for me, has a very positive anchor. Even though it had to do with all of this crazy shit that I was involved in, it still has a positive anchor. So I keep it around mostly for posterity. Yeah. Most of the stuff that's down there I haven't listened to in years. And there are really only a couple of bands left out there that I'll give the time of day.
Right.
But it involved a really big personal investment for me. And honestly, I don't think it was all bad. I think that there was some very innovative stuff that came out in the 80s. Talk about that a little bit later, too. But there are so many ways that they manipulate you and shove your thinking in directions that are just not healthy at all. Just for the sake of example, and we're going to talk about this subject quite a bit because it's a subject that touches teen life quite a bit. You are considered to be sexually perverted if you do things like consume porn. And by porn, I mean innocuous shit like Playboy.
Right.
Okay? Regardless of what it was, softcore, hardcore, anything in between, if you had so much as the desire to look at a naked lady as a teenage boy in evangelical circles, there was something wrong with you. You were perverted. There was something that was wrong. If Christ really lives in you, this is not something that you should really even have an interest in, much less be pursuing. And let me tell you, I knew a lot of teenage boys, myself included, that consumed a considerable amount of porn.
Right.
And I'm sorry, but when you're not getting the answers to your questions that you need at that age from people in your life who are supposed to be there to provide you with life advice and information like this, you go searching for it on your own. It's way easier today. We didn't have the internet.
Yeah.
We kind of had to sneak into the woods and uncover the stash that we had out there or that we found out there. That happened with us once. My best friend and I and several of our other friends were just sort of walking out in the woods in Hyde Park at one point and discovered a much older group of boys' stash. That actually was my first real introduction to that. And we were fairly young. We were like 11 or 12 years old. But that's when a lot of people start waking up sexually. Young boys can have these kinds of sexual awakenings a couple of years before they even hit puberty.
Right.
You know, I knew from a very young age that I liked girls. I just didn't know what I really wanted from them until I became a little bit more sexually aware. But I knew that I liked girls, for sure. I knew that I liked looking at those magazines, for sure. But at that young age, number one, you're not entirely certain of everything that you're looking at. And you're not quite sure yet why it's titillating. Now, these days might be a little bit different because I think the kids are growing up a lot faster than we did.
Yeah.
They're having exposure to these things a lot earlier than we did. But I know that for myself and for the friends that I hung out with, things did happen a little bit later. And our understanding of things was much more finite, I think, than it is now, only because the resources just weren't as accessible. And now they are. So you see it a lot more. And you start getting more of an education as to what sex is. And with all due respect, you get a bigger education about what sex isn't when you go to sources like the internet and porn sites and that sort of thing. You get a lot of mixed messaging, but I still think that a teenage boy discovering these things on his own is way better than having it explained to him by his youth pastor. I'm just putting that out there. But yeah, as a boy, you're shamed for that sort of thing. If you're a girl, your choice of clothes, hairstyles, jewelry, and makeup are heavily scrutinized. Yeah. And you can be branded with a virtual scarlet letter if you dare to wear more mascara or show a little bit more leg than your youth pastor can bear.
Yeah, pretty much. I remember that we had gone on a youth group. It was a big trip. We went to Busch Gardens, not in Florida, wherever the other one is.
Williamsburg, Virginia.
Yeah. And I met some guys and, I was hanging out with them. And my youth pastor made the joke on the way home that I was hanging around picking up guys.
Picking up guys?
I was picking up guys.
Because you were talking to them.
14 years old. And I was like, wait, what? And I'm like, I am probably like the most innocent little 14-year-old ever. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, I'm like, did I do something wrong? Did I do something bad?
That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get you to think that there's something wrong with that.
I'm like laughing on the outside and playing along, but inside I'm like, did I do something wrong? Did I do something bad? And I never, ever got over that. I never got to where I could be comfortable just having a good time.
Well, they don't want you to be comfortable having a good time. They want you to be comfortable with the fact that you're there for the purpose of feeding your faith.
Right.
not your libido.
Well, then
And
don't
at
take us
14
to
years
Busch
old,
Gardens.
well, yeah, that's the thing. But they kind of have to do some things
Right.
that help you feel a little bit more normal. They have to have you doing things that normal kids do.
Right.
But there's always the slant to it. Now, I don't think that on any of our trips to Action Park there were any impromptu Bible studies or sermons on the vans.
Yeah, no.
But it was still in the back of your mind that you're here with this group of people, and this is the association that you have with them, and now you have this image to uphold.
Right.
One of those trips to Action Park, my girlfriend wore a two-piece bathing suit, and it was talked about for weeks. And she was at one point asked to put on a T-shirt, a white T-shirt that you could just see through anyway.
Right. It's
So,
like,
I mean,
okay.
what exactly was the point of that? But I got a talking to from my youth pastor over that because my girlfriend chose her bathing suit. That was what she wanted to wear to Action Park, and that was somehow my fault because I was the older one. He literally said to me, "You're the older, wiser one here. Why didn't you just..." And he asked me if I knew, and I did know because she told me what she was going to be wearing. And he's like, "Well, why didn't you suggest something a little bit more modest?" I'm like, "Did you see what was going on in that park today? Did you see how every other girl there was dressed?"
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is how you dress when you go to a water park. All right? And one piece, two piece, I'm sorry, you still get a pretty good idea of what that girl looks like, regardless of what kind of bathing suit she chooses to wear. This was her style. This is what she wanted. It was a little bit rebellious because of how she was brought up. And yeah, I'm pretty sure it was a little bit of a fuck you to her parents.
Yeah.
Because she chose this thing, never really showed it to them, and I think probably walked out of the house with a one piece. But this was what she wanted to wear. It was her way of self-expression. And yeah, she wore it because she knew I would like it. There was that too. There's nothing wrong with this. It's not like we were disappearing and having multiple trysts in the bushes at Action Park. We stayed with our friends. We did everything that everybody else was doing. We
Right.
didn't go off alone together. There was none of that. Wherever the group was, we were. And whatever the group was doing, we were doing. And we weren't doing anything inappropriate. We weren't doing anything un-teenagerly.
Right.
But it was made out to be something way, way bigger than it actually was. And I got a real talking to about that. And it really just boiled down to the fact that she chose that bathing suit. And I went along with it.
That's so... That's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like, you are a teenager. She is a teenager. Teenagers going to teenage.
Of course. And it doesn't matter how much doctrine you shove down people's throats. But here's the thing, goes right back to our talk on mental illness. They can shame you into believing that you're a bad person. They can shame you into believing there's somehow something wrong with you.
Right.
If you actually like looking at your girlfriend in a bikini. No, there isn't. As a 17-year-old boy, I liked looking at my girlfriend in a bikini. So sue me. I was a normal kid. But in that environment, I was a perv. You see, that's the problem. And that story that you told is interesting because one of my friends was literally called a hussy by her youth pastor because, among other things, that identified her as a normal, well-adjusted teenage girl. She wound up going to several proms one year.
Right.
And one of them was mine. And there were questions about the gowns that she chose to wear because they weren't all floor length. Okay?
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And she was showing pictures of some of these proms at her youth group. And of course, her youth pastor's looking over her shoulder. And I don't know if it was in a group or if he pulled her aside, but literally called her a hussy.
Oh, for
because
God's
she
sake.
went to a lot of proms. You want to know why she went to a lot of proms? She was popular. She was likable. She wasn't popular in a mean girls sort of way. She was popular in this is somebody that you like to be around sort of way.
Right.
And she really was that. And by the way, I was with her at prom because my girlfriend at the time, the one who wore the bikini to Action Park, was not allowed to attend prom with me because... and I quote, the atmosphere of prom is sinful. That was her parents' take on it. I went to prom with someone who I considered to be a good friend and never even got a kiss goodnight. Okay? It was one of those things where she was basically doing me a favor so I wouldn't be alone on prom night. There was no way I was going to go to prom alone.
Right.
So she did me a favor by going to prom. She already had a dress because literally like a week or so before she had gone to another prom and just wore the same dress
Yeah.
to mine. And that was cool. So she didn't have to spend a lot of extra money. She got another really, really nice night out that she didn't have to pay for.
Yeah.
And we had a great time. Never even got a kiss goodnight from the Newburgh Youth Group's resident hussy. Okay? It was so innocent. She was a good kid. She had magnetism. She had loads of both male and female friends. And that was because she was likable. She was friendly. She had a level of confidence about her that you don't often see in girls that age. She was actually a little bit younger than me. She was like a year and a half younger than I was. And going to senior proms because she had the maturity to be able to at least attract the attention of slightly older guys.
Right.
And we had a great time. She had a real solid sense of self, and she was a good friend. So, of course, that had to be beaten out of her.
Right.
Of course, she had to be called a hussy. People liked being around her. And those of us who actually had the honor of having her accompany us to prom, we were given some great memories. None of them involved anything sexual. That wasn't the point. The point was to have fun and to be able to participate in a fun way in one of the most basic of teenage rites of passage.
Right.
And that was it. That's all we did. In my case, she made it possible for me to even have that memory because, like I said, there's no way I was going to go to prom alone. And yes, I was very bummed that my girlfriend was not allowed to go with me. But, you know, I picked them pretty mature for their age, too. This girl was younger than me, but I found her to be pretty mature. And I never got the first hint of jealousy off of her over that. Not even a little. She was more than happy to see me go off to prom. She had met this person that I went with, so they didn't really know each other, but they knew of each other. And there was no tension there. She trusted me, and she wanted me to go to prom. That was the level of maturity that she had then. But let me tell you, after she got with me and some of the things that happened, she got bombarded. I mean, she basically had her head held under the Kool-Aid over that.
Yeah, pretty much.
And it was awful. That entire situation was absolutely awful. But just the notion, just imagining being a youth pastor and saying something like that to one of my youth members, it's not something that would even jump into my head unless I might be a little jealous. You know what I mean? I really got that impression off of that guy, and not just with her.
Right.
And honestly, I think that was just a matter of, and now this was not much later, but definitely later. I keep thinking about that one conversation in Silence of the Lambs about how he covets.
Yes.
And what do we covet? We covet what we see every day. So being this person's youth pastor and having, with all due respect, a number of attractive girls at that time in that youth group, he may not have been the right guy to be leading them.
Yeah.
Because that comment to me was born out of covetousness and it was born out of jealousy. This is something that I can't have, so I'm just going to tear it down. And that honestly seemed like it was the most of it. But it also had a lot to do with the thinking that had been crammed into his head about this stuff too. Yeah. So it was a two-parter, but I think that it was fueled by jealousy and perpetuated by the thinking that was already in there.
Yeah.
There was nothing about this girl that I ever saw or even heard about that would ever lead me to believe that he had any cause or reason to say something like that to her. Zero. And to this day, it's something that kind of boils my blood to think that a youth pastor, under any circumstance, would say that to somebody in his youth group.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a boy, it's much simpler. You are a roiling maelstrom of hormones who needs to stay away from my daughter. Just stay away from my daughter. Your sex drive is your biggest enemy, and your right hand offendeth thee. You're constantly asked if you have problems with things like porn, masturbation, or sexual urges, and are repeatedly coerced into coming to the altar to repent of being the sexual being that God made you to be. Consensual, safe, and very surfacey sexual contact, like heavy petting or dry humping, with someone of equal or close to equal age is treated like rape, even when the participants are responsible and exercise enough restraint to simply enjoy a little clothes-on exploration with someone they like and trust, and stop before things go too far. And by too far, because that might trigger somebody to hear that, well, what's too far? So let me explain what I mean. In this instance, it means doing things at a certain age that are beyond levels of responsibility that someone that age can or should be expected to manage.
Right.
Things like making babies or contracting STDs or having abortions, those sorts of things. They weren't even considerations because the stuff that we do never even went that far. So ostensibly, the way that God made us isn't good enough. That's what they're saying. That's precisely what they're saying. The way that God made you, it's flawed. And then they turn around and say that we're made in the image and likeness of our Creator. So how do you get around that? They shame teens for having normal sexual urges, and rather than teaching them how to deal with them constructively and how to protect themselves should they decide to do a little experimenting, they frame these very natural, very normal, and healthy sexual urges as something that is dirty, dangerous, and self-destructive. Now, those last two could be consequences of poor sexual choices, and that's true. But with proper education and assurance that these urges are normal, it's much easier to curtail self-destructive sexual behaviors and encourage people to learn about themselves in a more self-affirming kind of way.
Right.
That's kind of difficult in a religion that wants you to die to yourself.
Yeah.
It's real difficult to pull off.
Yeah.
They talk about, and they talked a lot, because these are buzzwords. These are things that teenagers find important. Things like identity.
Right.
And freedom of thought. They try to get you to believe that they're turning you into free thinkers.
Right. Yeah.
But you're only a free thinker if you think the way they do. So, I mean, so much crosstalk and so much contradictory messaging.
Yeah.
And at that age, that is a dangerous thing. Cross messaging, getting different perspectives on things, that's why you just need to come to youth group. Right. And that's why you need a home church. Mm-hmm. So you're getting the same kind of indoctrination week after week. We were not discouraged, but we also weren't encouraged to be part of youth groups at other churches.
Right.
It wasn't something that was pushed unless they were other AG churches and they were in our section. I'm going to get into some of the other activities that there were. They trusted other AG churches, but they didn't really like the idea of you going on any kind of an ecumenical weekend like Vida Nueva. They didn't like the idea of you latching on to a Baptist church group to go to snow camp. They didn't like that very much because they knew that there was going to be crosstalk. Yeah. And they wanted all the indoctrination to come from the same place.
Of course.
Getting back to the subject of sexuality, in short, they hijack it. They hijack it and they get you to believe that there is something wrong with you when you experience your sexual awakening. This is a problem. It's not just a normal part of growing up. It's a problem that has to be dealt with.
Right.
So dating is very complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated and sometimes impossible. I know a lot of the girls that I may have had an interest in when I was younger weren't allowed to date. Technically, my girlfriend wasn't allowed to date.
Yeah.
But as long as it was something church related,
yeah,
or as long as it happened at one of our houses and we weren't out by ourselves, it was okay. But technically, she wasn't supposed to be quote unquote dating. She never referred to me as her boyfriend in front of her parents.
Right.
And I had to be careful because I've always been kind of an incurable romantic. So I had to be careful because a couple of times I got her flowers or I did other things for her, little gifts that came in on days that weren't her birthday or something like that.
Yeah.
And it raised eyebrows. It definitely raised some eyebrows. which is kind of sad because I'm sorry, that kind of old-fashioned, gentlemanly sort of thing is kind of falling by the wayside these days.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of women out there that would appreciate being treated that way, especially from a young age, so that they know that this is what's out there and that they don't have to settle for guys that are just going to use them and who aren't going to cherish the time that they have with them. And that was the message that I was trying to send. You know, I appreciate you. I appreciate us. I appreciate that we get to be us. And here's a little something that says, but it was dangerous because that put me in the realm of the boyfriend. And she didn't want to frame me that way in front of her parents.
Right.
She just didn't. Even though it was understood, it was something that had to remain unspoken. Because the moment I turned into her boyfriend, things got real complicated. So, yeah, dating, very, very, very complicated. I actually had a friend who was married. She was married to this guy, and her evangelical mother still shamed her sexually and wanted her to come home at night, which she did for several months until she weaned her mother off the idea that it was going to keep happening and that she was going to just live with her husband now.
Oh, boy.
In some families, it can be that bad. In some families, there's insistence that the new married couple lives with one of their families for a while, too. We did that, but it was accidental.
Yeah.
Just for a couple of months.
Yeah.
But it was accidental. There are families out there that do this entirely on purpose so that they can keep an eye on the kids. They're married. Leave them alone. Let them figure out how to be married. But it's not a normal, regular, everyday thing, but I've certainly heard about it more than once. When I found this out about this one friend of ours, I had already heard it from a couple of people at school a few years prior.
Yeah.
That they were in negotiations with the parents as to how they were going to manage this. And a couple of the couples that we knew at Valley Forge actually got married during Bible college so that they could escape that. Right. Now they had the excuse to live on their own because they were going to get married student housing. And they got married in the middle of the school year so that there wasn't a question of whether or not they were going to start out at somebody's house.
Right.
They got to start out on their own the way that they were supposed to. So I'd heard of this before. Not a terribly common thing, but it does happen. There are some evangelical parents out there that are just batshit crazy about it, even after these people are married. Yeah. They want to control their sexuality, and they want to keep an eye on things. Well, you know what? As soon as rings are exchanged and I do's are said, it's none of your business anymore.
Right.
It's just that simple. These kinds of puritanical rules are very, very, very pervasive in all kinds of evangelical circles. It doesn't have to be Pentecostal, because Word of Life had the most strict rule about this of any place I ever saw. It's so important to them that literally during the first meeting that they have on the island, you are made very, very brutally aware of their no PC rule. PC standing for physical contact.
Oh, boy.
To just make sure that you understood what they were talking about. They were talking about physical contact between people of the opposite sex. If you were two girls and you wanted to hug, that was fine. Yeah. Two boys, you want to pat somebody on the back, that's fine. But you couldn't even pat a girl on the back, give her a high five, or anything of the like. They didn't want us touching each other, period. End of story. And this is the same place that insisted on shorts that were fingertip length for boys and for girls, but they kind of lowered the bar for the boys a little bit.
Well, yeah.
Because who gives a shit if a boy is showing his legs? You know?
Oh, yeah.
But girls, fingertip length shorts, they encouraged socks and sneakers because, God forbid, you see a bare ankle.
Yeah.
That's how puritanical it was. They never came right out and said it, but the sentiment was definitely there.
Yeah.
The thing with the shorts was non-negotiable. Bathing suits for girls all had to be one piece. And if you showed up with a bikini, then you'd better be prepared to go to the bookstore and buy a T-shirt to wear over it.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the counselors were good sports. Some of the female counselors were good sports about that. and had extra T-shirts that they would give to the girls under their charge if they didn't have proper swimwear.
Right.
Also, if your bathing suit showed a little bit too much cheek, that wasn't good either. You still had to put on a long T-shirt to cover your ass, literally cover your ass. It was nuts. I mean, it's not like you're not going to see these things if you go to a public beach. It's not like you're not going to see these things ever. Mm-hmm. And when you put a bunch of teenage kids on an island together, not only are you going to see it, you can't get away from it.
Yeah.
So now we're in this environment where we're being bombarded with this stuff at a time in our lives where we are just waking up sexually. And now we're being told that normal, or then even looking on a woman with lust was committing adultery in your heart. So you'd best just keep to the boys. Okay? Let the girls do their thing. Keep to the boys and try not to think about the fact that there's a bunch of girls in bathing suits over there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll happen.
Yeah. Good bloody luck with that. There are other things, and I want to steer a little bit away from the sexual part of it, because there's a lot more.
Oh, yeah.
They steer you to church whenever your peers are off doing normal teenage things.
Yes.
That's a huge part of this experience. That's why youth groups exist. They stigmatize you for liking secular music, movies, TV shows, you name it. Mm-hmm. And then they provide real low-rent alternatives to things that are part of normal youth culture.
Right.
Things like Christian rock, Christian movies, and even today, you've even got Christian streaming services, so Netflix and chill stays chill.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Now, I will go on record saying that I still think that some of the more innovative music that came out in the 80s came from Christian rock.
Yes.
There were Christian bands out there that were doing things that you just weren't hearing on the radio. Pop and rock in Christian circles was a lot different, but there was also a lot more art involved in it back then.
Right.
It was more artistic and less evangelistic, but there was plenty of evangelical crap in the lyrics too.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Loads and loads. But it sounded good. There's still albums down there in that box that I would listen to just for the artistic value of them. Mm-hmm. And the effort that went into making them. There are albums like, and one of my friends here who I know listens will cheer me on with this one. Amy Grant's Lead Me On.
Yeah.
I thought was a very, very good album. Russ Taff, his self-titled album, I liked a lot. Michael W. Smith's Eye to Eye. Mm-hmm. Didn't like the messaging in these songs as much, but you had to admire what went into making them.
Right.
And the level of quality that came from them in a number of instances I thought was higher than anything that was on the top 40.
Right.
I also had a lot more exposure to it because I always did a lot with music. Mm-hmm. I did the skate rallies. I was the DJ for the skate rallies. I DJ'd a lot of events for the youth group and for the church. And I did 10 years in Christian radio.
Yeah.
So I was around the music a lot. I heard a lot more of it than average. But there are still albums out there that I would listen to just for the artistic value and the sheer amount of work that went into them and the talent that is evident in those tracks. Just what's going on in a lot of these songs. Some of the Christian artists that came out at the time, in my opinion, could rival bands like Simple Minds and Talking Heads in what they were doing. And I liked a lot of the alternative stuff. Talking Heads, Simple Minds, Depeche Mode. These were the bands that I liked a lot on the secular end of the spectrum.
Right.
And I won't say that there were Christian equivalents, but there were Christian artists out there that could give them a run for their money in terms of overall quality and talent and intricacy in the way that they presented the music. So it wasn't all bad. You just got to get past the messaging. That's really what it boils down to. But another thing that they do is they impose impossible rules of conduct that promote, beg rebellion, and then blame the teenager for just trying to be normal when they rebel. And we're talking about everything from how you interact with your girlfriend to how you behave in church to the words that come out of your mouth on a church van. I was shamed for so many things that went contrary to what the AG image of a teenager was. It wasn't even funny. And it got worse when I got into college.
Oh, yeah.
It got way worse when I got into college. Here's what this does. It makes you feel isolated.
Yeah.
But that isolation, enigmatically enough, comes with avenues for inclusion. But that inclusion typically entails being trapped in nothing grander than the equivalent of a big, elaborate habit trail. Sure, you can create an entire separate life in this out from among them kind of motif. But here's the thing. When you're in that habit trail, you can still see out. You know that the world is out there. You know that there are bigger things out there. You know that there's more to experience. But you're taught to fear even wanting to experience it.
Right.
Stay here in your cloister. It's safe here. The world is evil. You don't want to have anything to do with them. It reminds me, and this was many years later, but the first time I saw the movie The Village,
Yes.
I thought about this a lot. Their angle was not a theistic one.
No.
And I'm not going to give away the movie because, I mean, I could tell you precisely why they were there and why they were doing this. If you've never seen the movie, it's one of, in my opinion, it's one of M. Night's better movies.
Right.
M. Night Shyamalan, he also did movies like Unbreakable and The Sixth Sense and Signs. These were really, really good movies, and The Village was one of his. And the story there, I mean, it's evangelical culture.
Yeah.
To the hilt. Although I don't think that it had any kind of message of protest toward anything theistic.
No.
It also didn't have a theistic message to it.
No.
Signs had way more of a theistic message to it, and I still like that movie. I could have done without the very end, but I still like that movie.
Yeah.
But when I think about The Village, to give a little snippet here, we were talking about a group of people who lived in this cloister in the year 18-something. It was late 1800s.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. But there was this threat if you wanted to leave the village, okay?
Yeah.
There was this underlying threat of those you do not speak of. And they had all kinds of ways of perpetuating the fear, right down to having these creatures walking through their village at various intervals and whatnot. And as the movie progresses, you start learning what all of this is really about. And there's a lot more to it, and I'm going to leave it there because I feel like I've already spoiled enough of it if you haven't seen the movie. It's worth watching, especially if you're on your way out of this or if you've been out for a little while. You will relate to a lot of what is in this movie. And you'll relate to the manipulation aspect of it because there's a lot of manipulative bullshit that goes on in this community that really closely mirrors what you see in your average evangelical church. So when they're done taking your brain and putting it through a Cuisinart, and that's not difficult to do as a teenager.
No, it isn't.
Not difficult at all. Once they've got your mind completely and totally addled, here are the types of solutions that they tell you to employ or enact in your life. Pray for self-control. Pray for the right boyfriend or girlfriend who's going to want to have a godly relationship with you. Pray that God will help you know yourself better. How am I supposed to do that when I'm busy decreasing so he can increase?
Yeah.
How am I supposed to do that? Acknowledge your sin. How many times do I have to acknowledge it? I'm told that if I confess my sins, he's faithful and just to forgive. Well, is that just for the sins that I committed up until then?
Yeah.
We keep revisiting the fact that we're fallen, sinful creatures. And as teenagers, it's visited on us even more than it is as adults. I don't know how many times I was presented with a call to action to rededicate my life to the Lord because it was just assumed that because I was a teenager, I was rebellious.
Right.
Come back to the altar. Come back again when you fail to keep your sin under wraps. Rededicate. Recommit. Commit to secondary virginity. If you've failed in the area of sexuality.
Right.
If you get tired of youth group and you don't come for a while, you're a backslider.
Yeah.
But don't worry, we'll send our peer care mafia to your house to make sure that you know that we're watching you and hit you with a little, and I swear to Jesus, he called it this, positive peer persuasion.
Uh-huh.
I swear by God and Sonny Jesus, positive peer persuasion was the cornerstone of peer care.
Wow.
I've brought this up so many times. I've explained it in depth in a previous episode. I'm not going to get back into it. But suffice it to say, this is what we did if people stopped showing up for youth group. We literally went to their house.
Yeah.
And made them an offer they couldn't refuse. That involved things like pizza.
Yes.
It was stuff like that.
You put a pizza in the bed next to him?
Jeez.
You could cut that out.
No, I'm not. Why? No, there's no possible way I'm cutting that out. It was good. That's good.
Okay.
That's good. I could see it. I could see it. We talk about the pizza with this kid, and then he doesn't show up at youth group, and then the camera just sort of starts coming in slowly into his bedroom on Saturday morning, and he flips over and he feels something weird in the bed, and off come the covers, and there's the pizza. Okay. Godfather reference. In case anybody is at all confused here, it's a Godfather reference.
Yes.
And I highly recommend watching that movie too. You'll know precisely what I'm talking about. It's kind of a horrific scene, but in this context, no, that's staying. That's fantastic.
Oh,
But here's the thing. In all things youth culture, if your church offers an alternative, you should choose that.
Yeah.
Over interacting with friends and other people your age outside church. Mm-hmm. They didn't want you, they didn't even really want you interacting with your friends at school unless you were proselytizing them and bringing them to youth group.
Yeah.
And that right there is a really, really good segue into something that I touched on last week. But, and something that you and I had a conversation about. My best friend in high school was female. That's been a running theme in my life. I've always gotten along better with women than with men. It's just been a thing for me. I do have male friends. They're few and far between, and the ratio is way off, but I do have some. But this girl and I spent a lot of time together, and over the course of a couple of summers, spent a lot of time together, purely 1,000% platonic. There was never anything romantic. I was the shoulder she cried on when the boyfriends left, that sort of thing. And I was in the forever friend zone, but it didn't matter to me because I loved her in that way. Yeah. It was in that real deep friendship sort of way. I'm not going to say I wasn't attracted to her because she was definitely an attractive girl, but I never thought of her in quote unquote that way. But here's the thing. Rewind the clock a couple of years and she's just another kid in junior high school. At that point, I think it was like 9th grade. Okay. And in our weird ass community, 9th grade was still in the junior high school. So I had just started going to the youth group at Faith Assembly, and I was surprised to learn that one of my acquaintances, at that point I wouldn't really call her a friend. We locked horns a lot in like 6th and 7th grade, but now that we had this point of familiarity, now I was a Christian, and now it was okay to be my friend. I won't say that we descended on this girl. We definitely motivated her a lot to become involved with the youth group. But before she got exposed to all of that, she was a normal teenager doing normal teenage things and would probably have grown up to have, just a normal adult existence with a sense of autonomy and a sense of self and things that this religion just robs you of, that you never actually get to have. Well, we got her coming to youth group, and eventually she walked the aisle, and she got saved, and we were all so happy. And it was nice. We had this nice little clique of Christian kids, and she started developing her faith a little bit more. And myself and a couple of other people were pretty much integral with that. Yeah. Kept pushing her forward, kept moving her in the quote-unquote right direction for that. Fast forward a couple of decades, and my thinking obviously has gone way, way, way off into left field from there. I recently saw her on social media. Didn't even talk to her, but saw her and got curious. Took a look at her Facebook profile, and still, as drunk as they come on the Kool-Aid. And I looked at that and I said, this is my fault. I did this. This is my handiwork right here. I did this to her. And it goes right back to episode 1. You've got to learn to let go of that shit.
Yeah.
It's very, very, very important. But it's still stuck in my head.
Yeah.
It's like, what would her opinion be on this one? And it was a wild opinion about something. What would her opinion be on this if she wasn't getting her opinions from evangelical La La Land?
Yeah.
How much more rational would she be about this and a lot of other things? And the sad part is, I didn't even say hi when I saw her because I know that I would not get along with her for even 5 minutes at this point. And we spent long summer days in that apartment, listening to music, watching movies, going on walks. She would come to my house sometimes and we would swim and spend all kinds of time, alone time together. And all we did was spend time together and loved it and loved each other.
Right.
We did. We loved each other on that level. And it really, really, really hurts to know that because I was there and I was that kind of influence on her then, that this is who she is today. And it sucks.
Yeah.
I wish I would, and it's not the first time that I've seen something like this. And I just wish sometimes that there was a time machine that I could get into and not necessarily tell myself not to do certain things, but maybe tell a few people to steer clear of me so they could have a chance at having a fucking life. There's a girl that I know who's a missionary in Africa because as a teenager, she was influenced by me and my quote unquote fire for the Lord. And now she lives in fucking Africa and she's a missionary and she knows that I'm an atheist and she resents me. She's like, how could you steer me into this and then turn away from it and talk about it this way? Well, if it bothers you that much, you can follow me out too. There is that. But that's not going to happen because she's been a missionary for the last 20 years. Yeah. This is the life that she knows. And a lot of these decisions and a lot of these thought processes start when you are in this age category.
Well, that's why they want to get you right then. When you're a teenager is when you're influenced for your whole life. Your career starts when you're young, when you're in high school. It really does because you get inspired to do certain things.
Well, not your career doesn't start, but your life goals start lining up at that point. Yeah.
So it's like, the things that you think, the things you're influenced by as a teenager really just carry you forward or hold you back.
Yeah, but they create this culture. We talked about microcultures before. Right. But there's a much broader aspect to this that transcends normal teenage existence. If your church, and I started on this a minute ago and then sort of trailed off, if your church offers an alternative, you should definitely be choosing that. Yeah. Don't hang out with your school friends unless you're going to bring them to church. But why be a Boy Scout when you can be a Royal Ranger? Why go to the movies when we're having a lock-in this weekend at the church and we're going to watch Christian movies all night long?
Oh, boy.
Oh, I've seen some of these Christian movies.
Yeah. It's like Fright Night.
Some of them were cringeworthy then.
Oh, yeah.
Kevin Can Wait. Remember that one?
Actually, no, I didn't see that.
You never saw that one?
No.
We watched so many of these movies, and they even peppered them with the Mark IV movies from time to time, but most of them were lighter. And there were some of these movies that, and all of them vilified teen sex.
Of course.
And, you had the girl who was the token Scarlet Letter girl because she dared to explore her sexuality a little bit. So now we have to vilify her for the rest of the movie. And then you had, oh, God, there were these weird superhero type movies, but they were really, really badly done. Yeah. Super Christian was one of them. Oh, God. There was... a little bit later, there was Bible Man. That was after. Oh, man. But it was the same type of thing. So if you remember Bible Man a little bit better, you'll understand what I'm talking about. with some of these older movies. And Super Christian was one that I saw more than once.
Oh,
and
my gosh.
it was cringeworthy.
I'm
Absolutely
sure.
cringeworthy. Why do you need to go to parties on the weekends? I mean, let's think about it. We have a party every Friday night at youth group. Every Friday night at youth group, including music and munchies and games and anything that you would ever want to do, just without the vodka. Because, you don't need to be experimenting with that stuff. And I agree that I wouldn't want my 14 or 15-year-old at a party where there was alcohol. If I had to choose between a party that I knew there were going to be drugs and alcohol and sending them to a youth group function, I would still send them to the youth group function, only because I wouldn't want them making decisions and doing things that could have negative effects on the rest of their lives. I can always talk them down from the evangelical ledge.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if, let's just say it was Liam, and he got invited to a lock-in at a church, I wouldn't be thrilled, but I wouldn't be worried either. Right. Because the moment he came home touting evangelical rhetoric, I'd be able to strike back. And get his head back where it belongs. But at the same time, and I've said this before, had we gone through that, and thank goodness we didn't, because I honestly didn't want to deal with it. But had we gone through that, had he been invited to something like that and wanted to go, then yes, I would have let him. Because I feel like we all need to have the opportunity to experience what we're going to experience, take what we're going to take from it, formulate our own opinions of it, because he knows what Dad's opinion is. I would not have minded him seeing it firsthand.
Right.
But I'm glad that it never came down to it. I'm also very glad that it never came to the point where we had to make the decision to say, okay, you can do this.
Right.
Because I wouldn't have liked it. But I wouldn't have stopped it.
No.
See, that's the thing. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that I experienced and the ways that they deliver indoctrination. Now, I think my very first foray into Christian youth ministry was actually through CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization. And my first exposure to that was the confirmation retreat that they sent us on. You had a choice. You could do the confirmation retreat, or you could go for what they called a prayer day. I don't know what happened during the prayer day, but I liked the idea of the retreat a little bit more. I just, even then, not really knowing precisely what it was about, I knew that my mother had been on a couple retreats and that it seemed to do her some good. So the concept of the retreat was in my head, and I figured, okay, well, why not? Let's just do this. The confirmation retreat, I found out later, was based on a retreat curriculum organized by the Catholic Church called TEC, Teens Encounter Christ. TEC was also the foundation for Vida Nueva.
Right.
So it's basically the same progression. And a lot of the same things happened during my confirmation retreat that happened when I got involved with VN. And it was several years later, because they confirm you pretty young. I think I was like 13, or, it was either right before or right after I went to Word Life. I don't really remember.
Right.
But I do recall making the conscious decision that I was going to get confirmed in the Catholic Church. It was probably before. I'd say I was probably 12 when this happened. So young to be away for an entire weekend. But I remember that weekend really well. And the things that they taught and the way that things were presented. We had a couple of the teachers from my school who were deacons who actually worked on this weekend, and they were really cool people. These were people that I actually liked at school. So when I saw that they were there, it's like, oh, I had no idea. And that actually made it a little bit easier, made it a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more familiar from the very beginning. And when I did VN a few years later, the similarities were pretty striking. And I actually asked somebody if this weekend was based on TEC, and they said yes. So there was familiarity there. So it was easy to get the indoctrination in, because now I'm relaxed. It's something that's familiar because I'd been through something very similar before. But that was my first, was the TEC weekend. And then I got involved with CYO for a little while, like maybe about 6-ish months. Right. I was going to CYO, and that was it was a much more secular experience. Like, they played secular music at their dances. They actually had dances.
Yeah.
That's not something that you see in an AG youth group. You're not going to see dances because dancing is sinful. But the Catholic Church didn't seem to see it that way.
No.
And there were CYO meetings, but there were also dances and social nights, ice cream socials, that sort of thing. It was a lot more secular. And there were a few instances where they had like little spiritual lessons or devotions or something like that, but they were short. But then again, so is the homily in the Catholic Mass.
Right.
Usually a Catholic homily is only about 10 minutes long. So they're not going to bombard teenagers with something that's an hour long when you're going to go to church and you're going to be in and out in 45 minutes.
Right.
So even when they did plug the spiritual end of things, it was really, really surfacey, and it wasn't a big part of the overall meeting or event. So much, much more secular. The first time I showed up at an AG youth group and saw what the structure was of that, it was Jesus, 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 Jesus from beginning to end. And nothing but indoctrination from beginning to end. But again, I had been softened up recently because I'd just come home from Word of Life.
Yeah.
And I was gung-ho about this, so it didn't bother me that there was so much of that. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself because this time, I've talked about Word of Life before, but I talked about it from the angle of me getting quote-unquote saved the second night at camp. I want to talk a little bit about how they structured things on the island and how they set up the indoctrination train wreck. And it really was a train wreck. It was a mental and emotional train wreck that they put you through. And again, I don't think that was on purpose per se. It's just that this is the product of minds that have already been through this. This is the product of minds that have been pickled in the Kool-Aid. And this is what comes out. So I want to talk a little bit about Word of Life. When you arrive on the island, the first thing that typically happens, if you are by yourself or with a group, the first thing that typically happens is that you meet your counselor. I was a little freaked out when I met my counselor because he looked a little too much like my father.
Oh, dear.
For my taste. He really, really, really did. Okay? But he was a nice guy. He was a really nice guy, and he talked with me and stayed with me until I got on. First, we went over to they had a little camp bank. So if you brought money with you, you didn't have to keep it on you, and it was easier than carrying it, and it didn't get lost.
Right.
So whenever you needed a little bit of money to get something at the snack shack, you just went over to the bank and withdrew a little bit of your money. So we stopped there first, and then he actually carried my bags literally all the way across the island to where the boys' cabins were. And he grabbed all of my stuff, and I just walked and we talked. And I thought that was it was a really nice gesture.
Right.
But you can see what they're doing. They're grooming you.
Well, of course.
They're grooming you for what's going to happen over the course of the week. But he was sincere. I have to say, from beginning to end, I never saw anything opportunistic about this guy at all. He was sincere. So that was the very beginning. The first few hours of Saturday, very, very unstructured. And you're encouraged to kind of look around a little bit. You're encouraged to get the lay of the land, as it were, and just figure out where things are. You know, here's where the snack shack is. Here's where the bookstore is. This is the main pavilion. This is where we're going to have our meetings. This is where the beach is. They got you familiar with all the fun stuff and all the stuff that you needed to know. And then you were kind of left alone for a few hours and told at this time we're going to assemble back at the cabin, and then we're going to go to dinner. And then there were meetings. There were several meetings every single day. You had your morning Bible hour. Then there was quiet time, which was usually, it was a long time ago. I'm pretty sure it was like right after your morning devotions, and it was either half an hour or an hour. I think it was half an hour, because we're talking about younger kids, okay? But during quiet time, you were expected to read your Bible, or you were encouraged to bring a devotional book, and that time was time for devotions, basically. You also had devotion time at night after the no, not, was it after the meeting? They did things in a certain structure. And again, it was a long time ago. During the week, they also had seminars. And you could choose the seminar you wanted to go to. And I think they switched it up a couple of times during the week. Like a seminar was a day or two.
Right.
And then you would go and do a different one. So you weren't bogged down to the same seminar all week. Maybe that was just me. Maybe I just skipped around a little bit. I don't remember. But I do know that they gave us options. On Sunday, all day long, Sunday is a day of rest. We were not allowed to play sports. We were not allowed to swim. We were not allowed to do anything except sit around and reflect on God.
Oh, boy.
That was what Sunday was. Reflect on God, eat, and go to bed. That was Sunday at Word of Life. I do recall one year going up there in the middle of a massive heat wave, and they did something that to a lot of people on the island was unprecedented and allowed us to use the beach and swim. And that was only because we were going through a lot of water because people were taking a lot of cool showers. Right. Because it was almost 100 degrees and we weren't allowed to swim. So halfway through the day, around 2, 3 o'clock, they got on and made the announcement that we could actually go swimming. Yay. And that God would be okay with it.
Oh, boy.
I mean,
yeah.
So, but on a normal Sunday at Word of Life, you're not doing much.
Oh, boy.
It's supposed to be about rest and reflection. And then the real fun starts on Monday, where you are divided into your teams. And then come the barrage of activities, challenges, all of this crazy stuff that they do. But again, I'm getting a little bit ahead. I want to talk about what a meeting looks like on Word of Life Island. For starters, just the part in the very beginning about fight songs and collegians. Well, here's what that was about. Every meeting at Word of Life, well, at least the initial, like the first couple of meetings, I don't think they did this all week long. I think it was just like the first night or maybe the first couple of nights to raise the energy that they wanted to raise. They would do this thing where you walk into the pavilion and there's a bunch of people up on stage playing all kinds of instruments, a lot of brass instruments, and predominantly they were playing Ivy League fight songs. I still don't quite understand what the purpose of that was. They could have been playing anything, but they chose Ivy League fight songs. So the other part of that is that there were a lot of kids that used to do the whole thing where they would literally run up and down the aisles in the pavilion in big circles while this music was being played. And it was, I mean, it was like a stampede. And they would run around the pavilion until the fight songs stopped. And then everyone would sit down.
Oh, my gosh.
And at that point, we were introduced to the concept of Word of Life Bible Institute and would have this concept drilled into us all week long because they wanted us to go there when it was time for us to go. It was a 1-year thing that basically this is how you're going to fill your gap year before you go to college. You're going to come here and get really, really heavily indoctrinated. And this concept was really, really, really pushed with us. And the whole thing with the collegians, that was their swing choir, chorus, whatever you wanted to call them. And it really did have a flash mob kind of feel to it because most of these people were also counselors.
Right.
So when it was time to sing, they all just ran down to the front and they would sing some kind of hymn or whatever. Definitely, usually very upbeat.
Yeah.
And that would raise a little bit more energy. And then we would sing a bunch of songs that were basically hymns and really, really cringeworthy songs that I will not sing any of tonight, but I sang over dinner tonight, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Oh, those misty watercolor memories.
Of the way we were.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But that was how they started the meeting. That was usually like the first half hour of the meeting. And then it got down to introducing whoever the speaker was going to be. And that's when the real heavy indoctrination would start. And these meetings were held nightly. And the main emphasis of most of these messages was reminding us that eventually we were going to die, that it could happen today, and that we needed to accept Jesus or we would go to hell. And that was the consistent and overlying message to everything they had to say, was this whole concept of you will go to hell if you die today.
Right.
And you haven't accepted Jesus. So there was a real heavy emphasis on this. I've already told my conversion story, so I'm going to skip that. You can go right back to episode 1 if you want to hear that. But they had the nightly meetings, but then they also had Bible hour in the mornings. And they would bring in a guest speaker who would be there for the entire week, Monday through Friday. This guy would be in the morning meeting for Bible hour. So you had a good hour and a half meeting in the morning. You had another hour and a half or 2 hour meeting at night. You had quiet time. You had devotions. So when do you get around to actually having camp? To be fair, there was a lot to do on the island. There were a lot of activities. There was a lot of fun to be had. But it almost seemed like it was secondary. It was secondary because
Right.
they had a mission. They had a mission to accomplish, and that was to make sure that after having our brains softened up to all this stuff as children, now it was time for us to absorb all of this like sponges. And they bombarded us with doctrine and dogma, like for hours out of our day. And they would make sure that you were in attendance with these things because your counselor was he was charged with making sure that everyone from his cabin was there, or her cabin was there. And so you couldn't escape it. If you wanted to have fun, then you had to go be indoctrinated.
Yeah.
It was that simple. We did have a decent amount of downtime. It's not like it didn't have a real cult-like feel to it,
Right.
where they would keep you there until you were exhausted and just keep driving it and driving it and driving it all day long. There were breaks and there was fun stuff. But there was a lot. There was a lot of indoctrination. And a lot of it played on the whole heaven and hell thing, but there was also a lot of it that played on teenage insecurities to the hilt.
Yeah.
And they knew precisely where to jab at us. They knew precisely the type of things to bring up to us. They knew the things that we felt guilty about that any normal, average, well-adjusted teenager would just look at as part of growing up. But they would make us feel bad about being us.
Yeah.
And that was a big part of it too. Because if you don't feel bad about who you are, then you don't need Jesus, do you? So that was a big part of it. They wanted to push the notion that you needed Jesus and that you weren't good enough without him. And they really, really tapped into a lot of the fears and insecurities that teenagers have. Things about their identity, their sexuality, their future, all of these things. And that's where the Bible Institute came in. You want to feel good about your immediate future, then decide today that you're going to come and see us when you're done with high school. And even went so far as to have us make commitments where we would stand up and say, who's going to come to Word of Life Bible Institute? And we would stand up. Guess what? I stood up and I never went. And that was the story of a lot of the kids that went there. You know, statistically, it's a very, very small number that actually do anything with it. It's just like, I also told the story of the first time I spoke in tongues and got quote unquote called into the ministry, where like every person in that room stood up, but a very precious few of us actually followed through.
Right.
It was the same thing with that. I followed through. I just didn't go there. You know,
Yeah.
I went to Bible college. I just didn't go to their Bible Institute.
Yeah.
But I couldn't imagine a year of that level of indoctrination. Even Valley Forge was not as bad as that.
Oh, no.
And even Valley Forge didn't turn you into the kind of mindless automaton that this place turned you into. And that was the point. You were expected to learn everything that they wanted you to know about what they believed and adopt it without any kind of question.
Right.
And all of our counselors were students of the Bible Institute. And this was part of their ministry requirement. There were a couple of things that they could do. They didn't have to work the camps,
Right.
but the vast majority did because it was the simplest route to getting that requirement taken care of.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of students actually did do something with the camps, whether they were counselors or they worked in the kitchen or they were lifeguards, if they were certified as lifeguards. There were things. There were all kinds of things that they were tasked with doing, and that fulfilled their youth ministry requirement.
Right.
So, or ministry in general requirement. So that was what a week looked like. The weekends, very low key, because on Saturday you're either coming or going. Sunday you're not allowed to do a whole hell of a lot. And then Monday through Friday it was a free-for-all. And there was this whole competition thing where you were divided into teams and you accumulated points and all of that. Harry Potter before Harry Potter was cool. But you couldn't lose points. So I guess there's a difference there. You couldn't have points taken away. But whatever team amassed the most points because they won the most challenges and they won the most events, they had their own little celebration at the end of the week. And there really wasn't a prize. It was just, you had the satisfaction of knowing that you won. Right. That was as anticlimactic as it was. And they did do other fun stuff. Like they had, I think 2 nights a week, they brought in pizza. Mm-hmm. And they had, because we were on a lake, they had an old-time riverboat. And you could take a riverboat pizza cruise.
Aww.
They had, there were other things. Again, it was a long time ago, but there were little above and beyond type of things that they did that made it a little bit more fun.
Right.
We had a bonfire. I think it was on Thursday night. They always had a bonfire, and that was a fun time. The memories aren't all bad.
No,
it's just that when you look at it in retrospect and realize what you had to go through and what your brain went through to be able to enjoy it all, it can be a little bit jarring to think about it. But the overall camp experience for me was good. I enjoyed it. I went there several years running, and I enjoyed it every time. And the last year that I was at the island, I was 16. I thought that it was my senior year, but it wasn't. It was my junior year. I was 16 and participated in their program that they called TWA, 2-week adventure. So I went for 2 weeks that year instead of 1. And you could go for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And there were some kids that were actually there for the entire summer. And they were all TWAs. So if you were there for more than a week, you were in this program and there was even more stuff that you got to do. Canoe trips, you had your own little camp village where you were actually living in tents and not in the cabins. There were differences. One of the key differences was that on one of those days, they took you to the mainland so that you could do your laundry, and then they took you into Lake George.
Oh, nice.
To witness.
Oh, dear.
Okay? We went into Lake George so that we could go witnessing. We handed out tracts and we invited people to this little park where there was the classic demonstration of the salvation plan. You know the one that I'm talking about, where you've got the 2 cliffs and the gorge in between, and this is man over here, this is God over here, and then the cross right in between. The thing that's going to bring God and man together is Jesus.
Right.
And they would do that presentation for the 2 or 3 idiots that showed up. And that was pretty much it. And also part of our responsibility because this wasn't a fun time for us. We were fulfilling God's commission. Okay.
Right.
We were out there handing out tracts and talking to people and telling them about Jesus. And part of our responsibility was picking up all the tracts that people inevitably just threw on the ground.
Right.
So we witnessed, we handed them out, and then we picked them up when people smartly threw them down.
Oh, jeez.
That was an entire day of your TWA experience with Word of Life.
Oy.
So you got to go to Lake George, but you didn't get to enjoy it.
No.
I mean, we had stuff to do. They had this massive arcade that I decided to just walk into at one point. And then one of the counselors came in after me and said, we got stuff to do. It's like, well, why can we not just have a little fun too? Well, it wasn't in the cards. We had to hand out those tracts. And that was it. That was the only reason we were there. We were there to, quote, go witnessing.
Yeah.
And then we went back to the island. And that was that. It was the one and only time that we were off the island during the whole 2 weeks. Which, I mean, I don't want to paint it in a negative light. The island was beautiful. The very first thing that you see, you get off the boat and there's a big hill. And at the top of this hill is an amazing flower garden, usually teeming with hummingbirds. So it was awesome. And it smelled amazing too.
Yeah.
So, they want that aesthetic. They want this experience to be beautiful and pleasing from the very beginning. The very first thing that you see when you get up to the top of Cardiac Hill. And they called it that for a reason. Okay? As soon as you got up to the top of the hill, then all of this beauty right there in front of you, this massive, massive flower garden.
Yeah.
And it was cool coming back to that every year when I went back to the island. But it was a reminder to me of what we were out there doing in Lake George when we came back. Because another thing that it was teeming with was butterflies. And in Christian circles, the butterfly represents new life. It represents being born again. And I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't get to do any fun stuff. But then you see the butterflies and you start thinking, well, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, one of those tracts that you handed out stuck with someone. And now they're not going to go to hell because you had the guts to just hand them one of those tracts. So they make you think about these things. Whether it's direct or indirect, that big flower bed was there for a reason.
Yeah.
And there were so many other things. I could talk for hours about this experience, but what it boiled down to was that they kept dragging you back to that pavilion for more indoctrination. They allowed you to have fun. They allowed you to feel the warmth and the acceptance from the people that were there. And all of these things, these are things that are very important to your average teenager. Very important. Things like acceptance and, being a part of something and feeling good about something and feeling like people like you. These are very important to people in that age. And they made sure that you had that experience. They made sure because it was the easiest way to slip the indoctrination in there because you're feeling good about you and you're feeling good about the experience and now you're going to feel good about what they're telling you. So I'm going to move a little bit away from Word of Life, but just to give you an overview of what a year looked like in youth ministry in the AG.
Yeah.
The AG also had their youth camp. There wasn't a whole lot that happened leading up to summer. We did have the annual convention, which, at least in New York, took place right before Easter. So we had the annual convention, and then there was youth camp. And the youth camp for the AG was nowhere near the production that Word of Life was. It was also more of a camp-like experience, but still oozing with indoctrination.
Oh, yeah.
Then you had other things that weren't part of the calendar, but that you could be involved in. Things like Ambassadors in Mission, AIM. You could take an AIM trip over the summer and go someplace and build a hut that was going to get knocked down 2 weeks later.
Yeah, pretty much.
That sort of thing. And the thing that really impressed me, I don't know if impressed is the right word. I guess in context it'll make sense. But the thing that impressed upon me about that was the fact that when everybody came back from these trips, I never did one. When everybody came back from these trips, they were always put right up on the platform to talk about the experience. And it was always about how it touched and affected them.
Right.
There was very little about how it affected the people that they were going over there to try to reach with the gospel. It was all very personal and it was all very self-centered.
Right.
Which never boded well with me. And that's most of the reason why I never did one. It's like, I'm not going to go halfway across the world for me. I'm not going to go down to South America or to Germany or to Spain or to any of these places that they went to so that I can have a glorified vacation where I hand out tracts.
Yeah.
Everything was about how it impacted the people who went on the trip. And there was very, very, very little ever spoken about the impact that they had on the people that they were going there to reach. So that was one of the reasons why I never bothered with it. But we were talking about alternatives before. How about a grad banquet instead of prom?
Yeah.
Okay?
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I went to my grad banquet. It was what it was, but it wasn't a prom, not by any stretch of the imagination.
We were also in college too, so.
Well, I'm talking about
That's
high
right.
school.
High school.
That-
for church. That's right.
Yeah, that was something that they did for all graduates.
Oh, okay.
So if you were graduating high school or if you were graduating college, we all had the same grad banquet.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was not a prom.
No.
Harvest socials instead of Halloween. Just say no to Halloween and come to our harvest social, which, I mean, they were fun. I didn't necessarily have a problem with this. What I had a problem with was later on when I realized how innocuous Halloween actually is.
Right.
And what they do to make you fear it and hate it and make it look like
Right.
it's this bad thing. It was years later, but it really started to bother me, especially when you consider that I was in my mid and late 20s and still shunning Halloween because it was evil. Yeah, no, it really isn't. Then you had they had other events. You could have things like a Valentine's banquet where you could sit there with your girlfriend and never touch her. I mean,
There you go.
yeah, it was just an excuse to get dressed up for another little event.
Right.
And they usually had a decent menu. It was usually like a prime rib or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit more upscale. But I mean, we're talking as upscale as you can get in your church auditorium or in your church gymnasium.
Right.
Okay, that's The one thing that they did do on the regular, there were two things. There was the youth camp, and then there were the fall retreats. And the objective with both of these things was the same. And it wasn't so much about getting saved at that point, because it assumed that if you were there, you were either already a Christian or knew enough about it that if you were going to continue to reject it, well, that's your fault.
Right.
The real objective here was baptism in the Holy Spirit. And that was true of the youth camp, and they took an entire week to build up to it there. And the fall retreats, it was the focal point of the main meeting on Saturday night, was to get you fired up and speaking in tongues. I've already talked about my experience with this, so I'm going to move on from it. If you want to hear more, you can listen to our episode on glossolalia, because that's where I talk about this. I think that was actually episode 2, where we talked about glossolalia. You and I, right before we sat down to do this, we were talking about an interesting phenomenon here with youth leaders.
Yeah.
Now, most of these people were just happy, well-adjusted people who liked working with young people. Then there were the ones who were pushing 30 and hadn't learned how to interact with people their own age. So even though they were way, way off the grid in terms of being youth members, they volunteered as youth leaders. And they had more of a sense of identity with the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds than they would ever have with anyone in their own peer group. I encountered a number of people who were like this. Now, these folks, they had more of a tendency to come and go, and they were less consistent, because I think that they had a little bit more of an inner conflict going on. They knew that this wasn't normal.
Right.
Most of them had at least an inkling that these tendencies were not normal, and I think it really pushed a lot of them out of it.
Right.
Which, that really wasn't a bad thing. But it was an interesting phenomenon, because it goes right back to the notion of this stuff being shoved into your head when you're a baby. And it definitely ties in with the notion of childlike faith that I keep bringing up and have never done an episode on, and I need to change that. The bottom line is, you should not still be relating better to 16-year-olds than you do people within your own peer group when you're pushing 30. It's that simple. It's not a good thing.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of problems that can arise from that.
Yeah. And not the least of which is that the 30-year-olds might think the 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds might look pretty good to them.
Well,
There's a problem.
There could be some of that. I never saw any real problems in that area. I could see a lot of inner conflict with some of these people who were older, and you could tell.
Yeah.
You could tell. But they, their faith meant enough to them that, by and large, they dealt with that.
Yeah.
At least that was my experience. The ones that showed up at Faith Assembly, at least that was my experience. Most of them dealt with it. And some of them dealt with it by simply getting out of the environment.
Yeah.
And some of them dealt with it by just doing what they considered to be their job and making an effort to hang out with either some of the older youth leaders or at least gravitating toward people who are their own sex.
Yeah. I mean, I'm speaking from direct experience as a kid in a teens and 20s group with some guys who are kind of pushing 30. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I always...
Oh, we had a few.
Yeah, and I always looked a little older than, like, my age when I was a teenager. So it was just sort of like, why are these 33-year-olds hitting on me type thing.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
So that was kind of a creepy thing.
So there was a little bit more. They took it a little bit further in the circles that you were in, and they could have. I only know what I experienced and observed.
Right.
But you know what? The kids in the youth group talked a lot too. So I have to imagine that if there was some creeper that was making the girls uncomfortable, I would have found out about it, and I never heard of anything like that.
Yeah.
So maybe our group was just lucky.
Yeah, probably.
And maybe we just had more conscientious leadership who could see these things happening and were at least, whether consciously or unconsciously, steering them away from that a little bit and trying to be more friendly toward them. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you see that. And it is a kind of personality disorder.
Yeah.
I'm, with all due respect, with some of the personality disorders that I've had to deal with in the last couple of years, I'll take that over what I've been through recently any day. Because at least these people had good intentions, they had good hearts, and they weren't in it to score with a 14-year-old. That whether they were wired for that or not, it didn't ever strike me as being their agenda. At least not in my church. Your church may vary. I have no idea.
Oh yeah.
And I'm certain that there's a lot of that going on. I mean, I've heard more stories of youth pastors having inappropriate relationships with girls in their youth group than people who meet that description.
Right.
Much older and still doing the youth leader thing.
Yeah.
I've heard far more stories about youth pastors than I have about people like that. But again, your church may vary.
Right.
Real quick before we wrap it up, because I think that it's getting to be time to think about wrapping this up a little bit. There was at least somewhat of an agenda to push the whole youth ministry thing outside the church walls.
Right.
Now, several of my friends and I, when we were sophomores in high school, organized a Christian share group at our high school. Now, it was mostly the students, but we needed to have a staff advisor. So if you wanted to start a new club, you could. You had to find a teacher or a staff member who was willing to sponsor it. And we did, but the goings-on at the meetings were pretty much organized by us, by the kids who were in the group.
Right.
And we invited people regularly, and sometimes they showed up. And it was kind of exciting when they did because, we felt like we were doing our job. We were fishing and they were biting and it was all good. And we did Christian Share Group. I think it was either 2 or 3 years. I don't remember if it was still going on when I was a senior. I seem to recall 2 years of that. My sophomore and junior years were big for that. But all of these things, the Christian clubs in schools, the whole thing with See You at the Pole, and other things that infiltrate the public school system. These are all things that are inspired and motivated by youth pastors and youth leaders in churches, because the church cannot approach the schools or any places where they want to do this, but the kids that go to those schools can.
Right.
So we are motivated to do it. We're taught how to approach them. We're taught how to do it. And there were even resources out there for running a meeting that was smooth, that accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. I never used a curriculum. I never used an agenda. It was very free form, but I was very involved in the planning and execution of this. It was myself and several others, including the girl that we talked about earlier.
Right.
And we were like flagship members of this. And we were kind of the glue that held it together. And we did it for a couple of years running. That's one of the things that they do. They take it outside church walls and get the kids to start infiltrating their schools.
Right.
And another thing that they do is through other students, through young people, they establish clubs and societies on college campuses.
Yes.
So this is the last group we're going to talk about, is the college and career set. There are various campus groups out there, like Cru, used to be called Campus Crusade for Christ. Now they just call themselves Cru, CRU. You had Basic, Brothers and Sisters in Christ. These are the two that I remember the most, but there's loads of other ones. And one thing that these groups all have in common is that they emphasize the concept of separation while trying desperately to emulate secular social programs and services. They try to make it feel like any other club. It's like in the Breakfast Club. Do you belong to the physics club? No, that's an academic club. Well, what difference does that make? Well, academic clubs are different than other kinds of clubs. No, not to them.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. It's the exact same thing here. They have their clubs that are enough like other things that are going on campus that it will draw the right people to them. And it helps Christian students not feel so alone on campus. So the concept of anchoring to one's faith is central to groups like these. And honestly, when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to getting people to make that decision to follow Jesus, it really is the final Hail Mary to entice the fence sitters and prey upon kids who are lonely, socially awkward, not really adjusting well to the whole college thing. And it's the exact same thing as what happened with me on the island. I got there and bam, instant acceptance.
Yeah.
And if you can take someone who is awkward, lonely, has a low self-image, and put them in that environment where they have instant acceptance, they're gonna latch onto it. So that's the final Hail Mary with college students. Because even older teenagers and people in their early 20s still struggle with these things.
Yeah.
So if they haven't had proper exposure to this from birth to age 36 months, then this is an alternative. Because now we're going to prey on all of their insecurities. And we're going to draw them in with the promise that just hanging out with us will make you feel better.
Yeah.
Basically. They push the angle in 1 Peter 2:9 really, really heavily. We are a peculiar people. You are a chosen generation, a peculiar people, a people belonging to God, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. I think that's close.
Yeah.
I do know the reference is 1 Peter 2:9. Chosen generation, royal priesthood, a peculiar people. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And I had to think of the song
Yes.
to remember that. But that's what it says. And the whole part about being a peculiar people really appeals to students who are out on those fringes, who are out on those social fringes, that have trouble making friends because of their personalities, their anxiety, their looks, their weight, anything like that. But it's okay to be peculiar in this cloister. So that's how they get them. They're told that they're different and should therefore gravitate socially to people who share their signature brand of weirdness. And they find that acceptance in these groups. And the common thread is Christianity.
Yeah.
So there's your Hail Mary right there. So I want to end off with just a few thoughts that I had jotted down here as I was doing my research, because there are certain things that in some of these episodes I want to make sure get said. And I'm going to just go through some of the thoughts that came out while I was researching the rest of this. The way that evangelicals proselytize and indoctrinate young people with initiatives that literally begin at birth is one of the most divisive things I've ever seen. And I've seen it and I have participated in it. So I know what goes on. I know what's out there. I know what the mindset and motivation is behind it. The individuals who get involved in converting children and teenagers, by and large, do it with good intentions. I'm going to put that right on record. They believe that they're doing good for young people because they've been fed the same lies and have had their own senses of selves skewed by the same messaging. So they just think that this is a good thing, and they think that they're doing good for people, and for young people in particular. I'll also go on record saying that most of the people that I encountered as a child and teenager in these circles were ones that were of what I consider to be significant moral character, moral and personal character. They had real, honest, and sincere concern for the spiritual well-being of young people. And some of them, for me in particular, my youth pastor comes to mind, another individual from Chapel who took me on in kind of a big brother role for a while and was really, really great to me and to my mother while managing his own family, while in the process of adopting another kid on his own. He took interest in me and spent time with me so that I could have some semblance of a positive male role model in my life that I didn't have. This is the caliber of people that I've encountered as part of this, which kind of makes it more sad.
Yeah.
It really does. But I do want to play the positivity angle with this a little bit because, as I've said many times before, it's not about individuals. It's about the system that creates them. And these individuals were sincere. And I believe that with my whole being. They were sincere. They had real, honest, and sincere concern for us as kids. And some of the best people that I knew in evangelical circles were the ones who were closest with the youth group, with children's ministries, with campus ministries, you name it. I really liked most of them. I appreciated them being there when I was a youth member, but I really appreciated the help as the one responsible for running the youth ministries. I appreciated them being there and being that support base tremendously. It made my job, my work, a lot easier a lot of times. These were good, enthusiastic, and involved volunteers. And that type of person is gold when you are a struggling, burnt out, overtaxed, and fed up youth minister. Because these people really kept me going, especially during my internship. My internship was stress on top of stress.
Yeah.
But they really motivated me then, and they motivate youth leaders in churches to shake off some of that stress and keep moving forward. This, in and of itself, makes me angrier than anything, and here's why. What if some of these people worked with secular teen pregnancy prevention and support agencies instead of chaperoning True Love Waits rallies? What if they volunteered as tutors or mentors at their local community centers instead of wasting countless Friday nights chaperoning youth group meetings? What if they taught driver's ed instead of driving a church van? What if they coached Little League or volunteered with local town and civic groups to carry out practical, relevant sports programs for kids that teach values like teamwork and how to manage both victory and defeat, instead of spending countless hours refereeing post-youth meeting volleyball games or 1,200 rounds of wink? Imagine with me a world with secular groups who understand and accept the natural courses of human development, being the entities in charge of helping young people find their identity, as opposed to framing every last little part of their young lives that goes counter to perceived biblical morality, an oxymoron if I ever heard one, as on-ramps to the highway to hell. What if we just stopped trying to lead young people to Jesus and guided them into healthy avenues of self-discovery and accomplishment? What if we stopped telling children that there's something missing in their lives when they're 5 years old and simply allowed them to experience life with all of its joys, heartbreaks, happiness, and pain? What if we just let young people make the mistakes that they're going to make and provide objective, productive avenues of help when they happen? What if we simply taught young people how to manage their sexuality instead of demonizing every avenue of non-platonic interaction and expression, making them feel like there's something wrong with them for just so much as wanting any of that? What if churches simply stopped using the Bible as the remedy to every problem in question and allowed young people to be comfortable enough to engage in open, honest conversation with caring adults who have been there and can offer guidance, mentoring, and advice without the fear of being shamed or vilified? As far as I'm concerned, the remedy here is very simple. Take God out of the equation and let young people simply discover their own ways to get more out of life. And watch how quickly young people in this country and every place else that attacks impressionable youth with divisive, oppressive, self-denigrating evangelical dogma from birth forward start getting and staying unbound. enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.